problem was that the new officers had little knowledge of the workings of their new commands, and didn't have time to learn them before they were soon promoted again. As the war progressed, this problem became an epidemic within the army, with fewer and fewer officers able to fulfill their role. In fact, by late 1941, let alone later, officers in the lower ranks were constantly asking questions and giving tasks to those above. They were new to their role and inexperienced. They would skip ranks if needed, and this habit was actually encouraged by the top ranks by people like Keitel and Hitler. As the war progressed, and even more newer officers rose up the ranks, this tendency got worse and worse. The reality was that the entire staff organisation from top to bottom was massively overburdened, with lower ranks going straight to the top in order to get answers. While Hitler did meddle in the decisions of his officers, they wanted him to. In some cases, they needed him to. The officer corps simply couldn't cope, forcing more and more decisions to go higher and higher until Hitler. And coupled with the fact that Hitler didn't want his men to withdraw for no reason, this relationship benefited both sides. On the 19th of January 1945, Hitler ordered that all commanders down to divisional level should report any planned movement or action to him so that he could have a say in the decision. Sure, it looks as though Hitler was meddling, and maybe he was, but this order wouldn't have been necessary if those officers weren't as inexperienced and overburdened as they were. But wait a second, why was there such a need for officers? Wasn't the army getting smaller as the war progressed? Surely this would lead to the decline in the number of required officers, right? Up until Kursk in mid-1943, the army was actually expanding in size, not decreasing. This required more officers, and while the army started to decline in late 1943, after Kursk, there is something important to note. On a whole, German divisions were getting smaller, and there were more divisions. This meant that there were more individual units overall, like battalions. Now, the battalions required less men per unit, but still needed the same amount of staff officers overall to run them. So there were more weaker battalions, more weaker regiments, more weaker divisions requiring less manpower overall, but needing more staff, needing more officers, and Germany was out of officers. Now, this might seem contradictory at first, but in theory, smaller divisions are actually better and more mobile than larger, bulkier divisions. Smaller divisions are more flexible, which is great for a more mobile Blitzkrieg or Bewegungskrieg war of movement. The Italians realised this before the war, deciding to create binary divisions with just 2 infantry regiments rather than 3. Unfortunately, while this is perhaps correct, it requires more officers to fill those ranks. The Italians didn't have enough good officers and a few trucks to make these small divisions faster, which is why they struggled against the British. And as the war progressed, the Germans were trying to create more smaller or binary divisions. By 1944, the German divisions were operating in divisional groups, often the size of regiments. Perhaps this was down to the lack of officers. Yes, they had large numbers of experienced officers within the officer corps, but they also had a much larger number of inexperienced officers as well. Part of the reason that the Germans could reduce the size of their divisions was because Soviet divisions were smaller than theirs. The Red Army actually had this problem throughout the war, smaller divisions but requiring more officers. This is why they got rid of the corps level of command in the early war period and only put it back in later. This reduced the number of officers at corps level, freeing them up to go to the bottom level. But of course, this led to organisational problems, which is why in the early war period, the Soviets were less flexible in their operations. The Red Army in 1944